I'm going to give you an update of the best screening trial in the world, and it's mainly based on data coming from our own country of Sweden. So I have some disclosures, of course. Ferring, I'm working a lot for Ferring right now, and there are two minor companies in Sweden and a Norwegian one. So Ferring, for instance, is interesting because it started in my own city of Malmö once, 60 years ago, and it's the son of a founder, actually, who is running the company at present time. So you know very well there are 3 large-scale randomized trials. In fact, the 2 on the right side are actually belongs to the same European randomized screening trial. And then you have a gentleman sitting in front of me, Jerry Andriol, who introduced this PSLO trial. So the history of European randomized trial is actually that it was founded and initiated by Fritz Schröder in the Netherlands, and it started up in the Netherlands and Belgium. And then we in Sweden joined it. It was actually Jonas Hugesson, a professor now in Göteborg in Sweden, in the mid-90s, with 20,000 males. And then some other European countries like Finland, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland joined, and finally France. So we're talking about, in total, 8 European countries. And more than 160,000 men between the age of 55 and 69 were randomized. So the study is actually still ongoing, and I was happy before I left the EAU as Secretary General that we gave them some money to continue that study to follow the patients over time. And Fritz gave over this PI to Jonas Hugesson, who initiated the Swedish arm of the European randomized trial. And here you see the first publication, actually, one of the first ones, actually, by Fritz Schröder, looking at a European randomized trial and including all the centers, ending up in a 25% reduction in prostate cancer deaths at 13 years. The cons is actually you have only 21%. On the other hand, and also what is negative, the number needed to initiate is close to 800, and number needed to diagnose 27. It's absolutely too much. So then we have a Swedish arm of the same trial, and I will explain to you the difference between the Swedish arm and the entire cohort of a European randomized clinical study, because here you found all of a sudden, with a longer follow-up, a reduction of mortality by 44%. It's quite astonishing. And that was also published later on in Lancet 2010. And the number needed to screen went down to close to 300, less than 300. The number needed to diagnose 12. So it was astonishing. And why can you find a difference like this when you compare the Swedish arm versus the other centers involved in the European randomized trial? I will allude to that a little bit later on. And now we have a fresh paper, actually, with 18 years of follow-up in the Swedish arm of this randomized population-based prostate cancer screening trial. And, of course, the hazard ratio being diagnosed first year is 5.2. And you can see the prostate cancer mortality. In the screened arm, close to 1%, but in the control arm, 1.5. And you see the hazard ratio and confidence interval, but in the end, 35% relative risk reduction. And that is quite amazing, actually. So even if the relative difference in mortality is decreasing between the 2 arms with longer follow-up, the prostate cancer incidence difference is also decreasing. And secondly, this taken together with an increased absolute difference in prostate cancer mortality results in more favorable outcome measures. Number needed to invite 231, and number needed to diagnose 10. So with a longer follow-up, you can see the difference. I'm coming back to that in a minute. When I'm coming back to this trial and the follow-up, I found it's been accepted for publication in Cancer, Jerry, and that's the PCLO. And you can see there's no real difference between mortality in the organized versus opportunistic screening with 15 years of follow-up in this PLCO trial. And the reason for that is written clearly in this cancer paper. Jerry, check this now if I'm correct or not. But 90% of the control participants had at least one PSA test before or during the trial. And then 86% of the men in the control arm and 99% of the men in the intervention arm received any PSA testing during the trial with 15 years of follow-up. And finally, yearly PSA testing rates were 46% and 84% respectively. So it explains to a certain extent why you fail to really show difference between the screen arm and the control arm. When it comes to PSA testing in Europe, and especially Sweden, we introduced PSA at the early 90s, so it was fairly low. And the national guidelines in my country, Sweden, we didn't recommend PSA screening whatsoever, and we still don't. Only 3% was actually pre-screened in the Swedish arm of this screening trial. And exposure to PSA testing, however, has increased over time. And of course, if you had started up a screening trial 10 years later on, you would find a totally different picture, probably quite similar to the PLCO trial. 40% of cancers in the control arm, in the control group in the Göteborg were diagnosed through opportunistic screening in asymptomatic men at 18 years of follow-up. But look here, the difference between organized screening and PSA testing in Göteborg, reducing the risk of dying from prostate cancer, but increases, of course, the number of cancers being detected. So you can see here the prostate cancer incidence in the Göteborg screen arm. If you compare organized screening versus opportunistic screening, and of course, it leads to overdiagnosis, but on the other hand, you also find more high-risk prostate cancer patients. When it comes to mortality, you can find a real difference here. If you have organized screening going on, you can actually decrease mortality significantly. I'm coming back to that in a minute. So optimistic screening, if you want to introduce screening, you have to do it in an organized way rather than opportunistic screening. So here you found now no effect in terms of prostate cancer mortality. So although twice the number of men needed to be diagnosed to save 1 month from men from dying from prostate cancer with opportunistic screening compared to organized screening, you can see here the difference between organized screening versus no screening and opportunistic screening. The number needed to diagnose, 13 versus 23. Significant difference indeed. So coming back to possible reasons why this Swedish arm and the Göteborg trial show a large reduction in prostate cancer mortality. Well, we had younger men at start. We started actually at the age of 56 at baseline, and in the European other centers, 60. We had a lower PSA threshold for prostate biopsy, 2.5 to 3, and in the European randomized trial, they had mainly 3 to 4. So it comes down to what David told us this morning, but maybe we should even lower that threshold, but I don't think so. More intense screening every 2 years. In the other centers across Europe, it was between 4 and 7 years, unfortunately. And also long duration of screening every 2 years from the age of 50 to up to 64 and all the way up to 70. And the median was 10 years. And high biopsy compliance, look at this, 93% of all the males were compliant to undergo biopsies, whereas in the PLCO trial, correct me if I'm wrong, it was only 1/3 of the men being screened. And limited contamination and long reported follow-up, now up to 18 years. So it makes a difference, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There was also an interesting comparison between the screen population in Göteborg and my own center in southern Sweden, Malmö, because we have access to freezers where we have blood samples stored for more than 40 years in a preventive project initiated by my former teacher and professor. So by using all these blood tests from Malmö, we shipped them over to Memorial Sloan Kettering because they've been able to recruit 4 of my best residents, including Hans Lilja, because they have the resources and money. Jim, I'm not accusing you here, and Peter Scarino. because they could do a much better job in your center. We didn't have that kind of resources. So Sigrid Carlson is just an example of all these very brainy people. So looking at this screen group and unscreened group, actually, is very interesting because there is a major difference when it comes to ratio of benefits to harms of PSA screening varies with blood levels at the age of 60. So here you can find really a difference between screened populations and those not being screened whatsoever. And we found also, when we looked at the median PSA at the age of 60, around 1 nanogram per mil, but also for men with a PSA less than 2 nanogram per mil, and that was 3/3 of the population at the age of 60. Continuous screening led to a large increase in prostate cancer incidence, but no decrease in mortality over 15 years of follow-up. I think that's a very important statement. So if you have a PSA of less than 2, you cannot expect that you can decrease mortality with 15 years of follow-up. However, if you have a PSA at the age of 60 above the 2, it makes a difference because then you can find a large reduction in prostate cancer deaths and also decreased number of patients needed to be invited, 23, and the numbers needed to diagnose of 6. And that was published by Sigrid Carlson in British Medical Journal a couple of years ago. So now, hold your breath, because this is fresh data published this year in European Urology by Sigrid, based on the screening trial in Sweden. Starting regular screening at the age of 54 reduced prostate cancer mortality, believe it or not, by more than 70% with a 70 years follow-up compared to no screening whatsoever. And the number needed to invite, as you can see here, 176, number needed to diagnose 16. I would like, of course, to reduce that numbers as well, of course. But look here, the difference between the screened and an unscreened population, and from my own country of Sweden, astonishing. So another screening trial that is going on was initiated recently in Stockholm. That's the Stockholm 3 study by Henrik Grönberg and co-workers. You can see they introduced not only the callicrines but also 2 genetic markers and clinical data, volume, PSA, not PSA examination, DRE, etc., etc. And we're talking about almost 150,000 men and with a PSA 1 and above, and 10% of his Stockholm 3 risk of high-grade prostate cancer is equal to sensitivity to PSA 3 and above. And you can also see there was a consistent with prior observations like PHI and FK score already mentioned here this morning, adding callicrine markers to the Stockholm 3 model, that improves predictions of high-grade prostate cancer over PSA alone. However, there are some unclarity because it's unclear whether the genetic score adds predictive value to the protein markers, since it was added to the stepwise model before the markers. And secondly, feasibility of the array and trust, of course, volume of screening tools, it was not really elucidated in the paper. On the other hand, it showed clearly in the first paper published in Lancet Oncology that you can reduce overdiagnosis by 17% and unnecessary biopsies by 1/3. On the other hand, the number of high-grade cancers caught or missed by this model compared to PSA alone was not reported, unfortunately, due to the paired design. So that's the drawback of this trial, in my opinion. So this is my last slide, Dave. Summary and update of the European and especially the Swedish screening data. First of all, with longer follow-up in the trials, the effect of regular PSA-based screening on significantly is associated with significant reduce of prostate cancer mortality, and it is sustained. Secondly, the number needed to invite, the number needed to diagnose become favorable with longer follow-up, and that is clearly demonstrated here today. And screening should not start too late in life. We say definitely not later than 55. I would say 50. And some of us in Europe actually 45. And if you have a family history, we have an agreement in my country, we should start already at the age of 40. Regular organized screening may be more beneficial than opportunistic screening in terms of net benefit, and I've shown some evidence for that. And finally, screening can be risk stratified, and based on all the lectures this morning, I think we can do a better job not using PSA alone, and taking into account the men's age, PSA levels, and general health to determine who, when, and how often to screen. So that's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.